ingredients. So let's make some pizza. Now this recipe is based on a Neapolitan style pizza, meaning that the dough will consist of just flour, water, salt, and yeast, and we'll be topping it with a simple to make raw tomato sauce along with some fresh mozzarella cheese. So it's great even in its simplest form, but it's also a recipe that can be easily built upon and modified to suit your preferences. So to make it, we'll start off by making the dough. And ideally you'll want to do this about 2 to 3 days before you plan to bake the pizza, although you can make this all on the same day if you prefer. But for the best flavor, the dough will need to rest in the fridge for a few days before it's ready to use, which we'll talk about in more detail later. Either way, start off by adding 380 grams of bread flour to a large bowl along with 8 grams of salt, 1 gram of instant yeast, which is about 1/4 teaspoon, and 270 grams of room temperature water. Then stir until everything is fully incorporated. And this will make enough dough for about 2 12-inch pizzas. So I'm using King Arthur bread flour here, which is my personal favorite flour to use, but you could also just use all-purpose if that's all you've got. The bread flour basically just helps to develop a stronger gluten network, so you'll end up with a slightly chewier dough, but again, you can achieve a pretty similar result using all-purpose flour. And as with all baking recipes, it's always best to measure by weight rather than volume, but I will leave volumetric measurements in the full post on my website for those of you that don't have a kitchen scale. Anyways, I like to start by stirring with my dough whisk, then transition to using my hands just to be sure that all of the ingredients are fully incorporated. But the nice thing about this recipe is that you don't have to knead the dough because we're instead just going to allow the gluten to develop over time. So since we're using such a small amount of yeast, it'll allow for a slow rise in the dough, which creates more acidity and much more complexity of flavor, and it gives the gluten plenty of time to develop. So for now, we're just going to let the dough rise until it's anywhere from about double to triple its current size, which should take about 5 to 10 hours depending on your environment. And at this point, I like to transfer the dough to a lightly oiled clear container so I can see exactly how much it rises, but you can certainly leave it in the same bowl if you prefer. Either way, you'll just need to cover your container and leave it out at room temperature, and once the dough has grown in size by anywhere from about 2 to 3 times, it's ready to use. So in my case, my environment was around 72 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 22 degrees Celsius, and it took my dough about 6 hours to more than double in size. But usually I'll just prepare my dough in the evening and then let it rise overnight, because this recipe is pretty forgiving, so even if your dough more than triples in size, it's really no big deal. So here we are after about 6 hours, and again we can see that my dough has more than doubled in size. So I'm just going to remove it out to a lightly floured surface to divide it up. And for this recipe, I'll divide it into 2 equally sized pieces, but you could divide it into 3 if you want smaller, more personal sized pizzas. And I also like to weigh out my pieces to make sure that they're the exact same size. Then just place each piece into a lightly oiled quart-sized deli container or something similar. But if you don't have anything like this, you could just use Ziploc bags or even just tightly wrap them in plastic wrap. Either way, we'll next need to place these containers into the fridge for 2 to 3 days for our cold fermentation. So again, while the dough is in the refrigerator, it'll continue to ferment very slowly, which will not only give the gluten plenty of time to develop, but it'll also create a lot of great flavor in the dough. So I also like to label my containers with the date before I put them in the fridge so I know exactly when they went in. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, if you're in a hurry to make your pizza, you don't absolutely need to perform this cold fermentation. So instead, you could just let the dough rise for another few hours at room temperature until about doubled in size again. But as I mentioned, to achieve the desired flavor and optimal gluten development, you really don't want to skip the cold fermentation. So now I'm just going to place my containers into the fridge and I'll be back in 2 to 3 days. Alright, I'm back 3 days later and we're ready to start cooking our pizzas. So you'll want to take the dough out of the fridge at least an hour before you plan to cook it to allow it to come to room temperature and rise just a little bit more. And in the meantime, there's 2 pieces of equipment that I'd strongly recommend if you make a lot of pizza at home. The first of which is a pizza stone or a pizza steel. In this case, I'm using a pizza stone because that's just what I have, but a lot of people claim that you can achieve even better results with a pizza steel, so I do plan to get one of those for myself soon so I can compare the results. Next item I want to discuss is a pizza peel, which you'll use to slide your pizza out into the oven. So this one isn't quite as essential, and a non-rimmed baking sheet will do the trick if you don't have one, but a peel definitely makes the process a lot easier. So they come in either wood or metal, and basically the wooden one is better for sliding the pizza out into the oven, and the metal one is better for removing it from the oven. So if you're only gonna get one, you'll wanna get the wooden one because it really does make a big difference in preventing the pizza from sticking as you slide it out into the oven. Because there's nothing worse than spending all of that time making your own pizza just to have it get all mangled as you try to slide it out into the oven. So of course, I'll leave the links to all of this equipment in the description below. Now getting back to the recipe, the next thing you'll want to do is preheat your oven to the hottest temperature it'll go, which in my case is 550 degrees Fahrenheit or about 290 degrees Celsius for at least 1 hour. And you'll want to do this with your pizza stone or steel inside, set to the second highest rack of your oven. And while that's preheating, we'll have plenty of time to make the sauce. So for the best possible flavor, you'll want to use canned San Marzano tomatoes, and you'll just need one 28-ounce can. But if you can't find those, you can just use any whole canned tomatoes that you can find. And to make this sauce, we are going to use a food processor, but you can definitely make it by hand if you don't have one. So we'll start by transferring the tomatoes to the bowl of our food processor, and to prevent the sauce from becoming too liquidy, we'll want to avoid transferring any excess liquid from the can, so that's why I'm using tongs here. Next, you'll just want to add at a minimum a couple pinches of salt to taste and a few grinds of black pepper, but I also like to add some garlic, basil, and oregano for some extra flavor. So in this case, I added 3 small cloves of garlic, 4 leaves of fresh basil, and about a half teaspoon of dried oregano. But again, these are all optional and the sauce will still taste great with just salt and pepper. So then pulse all of those ingredients in your food processor for a few seconds until the sauce has reached your desired consistency, then give it a taste and season as necessary with additional salt and pepper. Now if you're making this sauce without a food processor, you can pretty easily crush the tomatoes by hand, and you'll of course just want to mince up your garlic and herbs before adding them to the sauce in that case. So doing it that way results in a more rustic sauce with larger chunks of tomato, which you might even prefer. And personally, I do like it that way sometimes, so even though I have a food processor, I'll have to make the sauce by hand. But anyways, once the sauce is thoroughly combined and seasoned to your liking, we're actually going to strain it out just to remove a bit more moisture. Because we're not going to cook the sauce before baking the pizza, so we want to avoid any excess liquid in the sauce so that the pizza doesn't get soggy. Now if you don't mind a bit of excess liquid, this step is certainly optional, but personally I'm not a fan of it, so I do like to strain my sauce. And we can see that by the time the sauce is done straining, we've removed a lot of moisture from it, so this step does make a big difference. Now finally, you can just transfer your sauce to a separate container and set that aside for the time being. So of course, if you like, you can even make this sauce a few days in advance and then just keep it in your fridge until you're ready to use it. But since we're gonna make the pizza right now, we can go ahead and prepare our toppings as well. And of course, toppings are very much a personal preference, but the one topping that you will need is fresh mozzarella cheese. So I usually get Bel Gioioso brand mozzarella, which should be readily available at most grocery stores, and America's Test Kitchen ranked it as their favorite fresh mozzarella, so you really can't go wrong with it. But if you can't find it, any other fresh mozzarella should work just fine. So start by cutting it into thin slices, then I also like to tear each slice into 2 or 3 smaller pieces, but again, just do whatever you like. And my favorite type of pizza to make is margherita, so for that I'll also just need some fresh basil. But I'm also going to make a pepperoni pizza, so I'll cut up some pepperoni for that as well. Then once all of your toppings are prepared and your oven is preheated, we can get ready to bake the pizza. So first you'll want to prepare your pizza peel by dusting it with either cornmeal or semolina flour, or both as I'm doing here. But if you don't have either of these, you can really just use any type of flour. I just prefer these because of the bigger grains, which helps the pizza to slide off easier, and they also don't leave as much of a powdery residue on the pizza. So then just bring your dough back out and place it onto a lightly floured surface to start shaping. And we'll basically just stretch it out from the center. So start by pressing straight down in the middle, then gradually moving out toward the edges, being sure to leave a slightly thicker portion around the rim, which will end up forming the crust. So go ahead and keep stretching like so, trying to maintain as round of a shape as possible. Then once it's maybe about 6 inches in diameter, go ahead and pick the dough up, supporting it with your knuckles, and start spinning and stretching like so, letting gravity do most of the work to stretch it out. Again, be sure to keep the dough moving so it gets evenly stretched and stays as round as possible. And you'll also want to be careful not to let it tear, but if your dough has developed a strong gluten network, you should be able to stretch it pretty thin without it tearing. So you can really make it as thick or as thin as you'd like, and once it's stretched to your liking, just gently place it onto your pizza peel. And you should see that if you shimmy your peel back and forth, there shouldn't be any sticking, but if there is, you'll just want to add a bit more cornmeal or semolina flour underneath the dough. Then go ahead and add your sauce, cheese, and toppings. Personally, I like a pretty hefty amount of sauce, and in this case I used about a 1/3 cup of sauce and about 2 ounces of mozzarella cheese. Then I just finished it off with a few leaves of hand-torn fresh basil. Now just quickly transfer the pizza onto your preheated pizza stone, and once the pizza is in the oven, switch on the broiler to allow it to cook extra quickly. So it should take about 5 or 6 minutes total, and I also like to rotate the pizza after about 4 minutes to ensure that all sides get browned evenly. And once it's done, just remove it to a wire rack to cool for a couple of minutes, then cut into it and enjoy. This is my personal favorite recipe to both make and eat, and a lot of the people I've made it for have said that it's some of the best pizza they've ever had, so I hope you give it a try. And if you want to see how to make some more easy homemade baked goods, be sure to click that playlist in the bottom right corner of the screen. I'll see you all in the next one.